The morning mist clung to the Pennsylvania countryside like a shroud, but it could not hide the terrible truth that lay beneath. Dr. Jonathan Letterman walked slowly across the battlefield of Gettysburg, his medical bag heavy in his hand, though not as heavy as the weight pressing down upon his chest. It was July 5th, 1863, and the guns had been silent for 2 days now, but the echoes of their thunder still reverberated through his very soul. The sight before him defied comprehension. Where once green fields had rolled gently toward the town, now crimson earth stretched as far as the eye could see. Bodies lay scattered like broken dolls, some in the blue of the Union, others in the gray of the Confederacy, but in death, their uniforms mattered little. What struck Letterman most profoundly was not the carnage itself, but the expressions frozen on the faces of the fallen, some peaceful, others twisted in final agony, all speaking to the horror of what had transpired here. As the chief medical officer of the Army of the Potomac, Letterman had witnessed his share of battlefield devastation, but Gettysburg was different. The 3-day battle had claimed over 50,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest single engagement of the entire Civil War. The numbers were staggering, but they could not capture the human cost that now lay before him. Each body represented a son, a father, a brother who would never return home. The wounded who survived presented their own haunting tableau. In the makeshift field, hospitals scattered throughout the area, men lay moaning in pain, calling out for their mothers, their wives, their children. Some stared blankly at the canvas ceiling above them, their minds having retreated to some unreachable place where the horrors they had witnessed could not follow. Letterman recognized the look. He had seen it before, though never on such a scale. Private Timothy Walsh of the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment lay on a blood-stained stretcher, his left arm shattered by a Confederate Minié ball. But it was not the physical wound that concerned Letterman most. Walsh's eyes held a 1,000-yard stare, and when the doctor attempted to examine him, the young man flinched violently at every touch, as if still expecting the next bullet to "Find him, doctor," Walsh whispered, his voice barely audible above the moans of the other wounded. "I can still hear them screaming. The rebels, our boys, they all sound the same when they're dying." Tears streamed down his dirt-stained cheeks. How do I make it stop? Letterman had no answer. Medical science could mend broken bones and stitch torn flesh, but it offered no salve for the invisible wounds that cut deeper than any bayonet. He had begun to notice patterns among the survivors: the trembling hands, the inability to sleep, the way grown men would weep uncontrollably at the slightest provocation. Some refused to speak at all, having retreated so far into themselves that they seemed more ghost than man. According to accounts from the Philadelphia Inquirer, the battle's aftermath would leave scars on the community that would endure for generations. Local residents, many of whom had opened their homes to the wounded, found themselves forever changed by what they had witnessed. The town of Gettysburg itself bore the physical marks of the conflict: bullet holes in buildings, bloodstains on floors, and the overwhelming stench of death that would linger for months. As evening approached, Letterman continued his rounds, knowing that the true battle was just beginning. The war might move on, but for those who had survived Gettysburg, the fighting would continue within their own minds and hearts, a conflict that would prove far more difficult to win than any engagement with the enemy. Captain Robert Carter of the 2nd Corps stood at the edge of Cemetery Hill, his uniform still bearing the stains of the battle that had ended 3 days prior. The irony was not lost on him that he now gazed upon an actual cemetery while surrounded by the fresh graves of his fallen comrades. The evening light of July 8th, 1863, cast long shadows across the hallowed ground, and Carter found himself wondering if he would ever escape the darkness that had settled over his soul. The nightmares had begun immediately. Every time Carter closed his eyes, he was transported back to that hellish afternoon when Pickett's charge had thundered across the open field below. He could see the faces of the Confederate soldiers as they advanced, their battle cries echoing across the landscape. More haunting still were the faces of his own men as they fell around him, young faces, some barely old enough to shave, their lives cut short in an instant of violence. Sergeant Major William Thompson approached cautiously, recognizing the signs of distress in his commanding officer. Thompson had served under Carter for 2 years, and he had never seen the captain in such a state. The man who had once led his troops with unwavering confidence now seemed fragile, as if the slightest touch might shatter him completely. "Sir," Thompson said softly, "the men are asking about you. They need to see that you're all right." Carter turned slowly, his eyes reflecting a pain that went beyond physical wounds. "All right," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Thompson, I watched 18-year-old boys die in my arms. I gave orders that sent good men to their deaths. How can I ever be all right again?" The sergeant major had no answer. He had seen the captain's anguish multiply with each casualty report, each name added to the growing list of the fallen. The 24th Michigan Infantry had lost nearly 2/3 of its strength during the 3-day battle, and Carter seemed to carry the weight of every single loss. In the town below, the civilian population struggled with their own trauma. Elizabeth Thorne, the caretaker of Evergreen Cemetery, had fled with her family during the fighting, only to return to find her small cemetery overwhelmed by the dead. At 6 months pregnant, she had spent days helping to bury the fallen, a task that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The sight of young men, some no older than her own brothers, being lowered into hastily dug graves had shaken her faith in humanity itself. The psychological toll extended far beyond the immediate participants. Families throughout Pennsylvania and beyond waited anxiously for news of their loved ones, many of whom would never return. The telegraph lines hummed with desperate inquiries, and train stations became gathering places for those hoping against hope to see familiar faces among the returning wounded. Dr. Letterman had begun to document what he was observing among the survivors. In his private journal, he wrote of soldiers who could no longer function in normal society, men who would start at the slightest noise or break down in tears without warning. Some had developed a peculiar sensitivity to loud sounds, diving for cover at the crack of thunder or the slamming of a door. Others seemed to have lost the ability to connect with their fellow human beings, as if the horror they had witnessed had severed some essential link between them and the rest of the world. The local churches had become unofficial gathering places for both the wounded and those seeking to make sense of the catastrophe. Reverend Michael Jacobs of Pennsylvania College found himself overwhelmed by parishioners seeking answers to questions that had no easy solutions. How could a just God allow such suffering, they asked. What purpose could such carnage possibly serve? As referenced in Harper's weekly reports from the period, the battle's aftermath revealed not just the physical destruction of war, but its profound psychological impact on all who experienced it. The concept of what would later be understood as post-traumatic stress was beginning to emerge in the observations of medical professionals and clergy alike, though they lacked the vocabulary to properly name what they were witnessing. Night fell over Gettysburg once again, but for many, darkness brought no peace. In farmhouses and field hospitals, in the homes of civilians and the tents of soldiers, the battle continued to rage in the minds of those who had survived, a conflict that would prove far more enduring than the 3 days of fighting that had preceded it. The hot July sun beat down mercilessly on the battlefield as burial details continued their grim work on July 10, 1863. Corporal James Hendricks of the 83rd Pennsylvania Infantry moved mechanically through the rows of bodies, his movements automatic after days of this hellish duty. Each face he looked upon seemed to burn itself into his memory, adding to the growing collection of images that would haunt him long after the war ended. Hendricks had volunteered for burial detail not out of any sense of duty, but because he found it impossible to sleep. The nightmares came the moment he closed his eyes, visions of charging Confederate cavalry, the screams of wounded horses, the sight of his best friend's head exploding in a shower of blood and bone. At least working. Among the dead, he could pretend that the trembling in his hands was from exhaustion rather than fear. The young corporal was not alone in his torment. Throughout the Union camp, soldiers displayed behaviors that their officers found increasingly difficult to understand or manage. Some men would fly into violent rages at the slightest provocation, while others had become so withdrawn that they seemed almost catatonic. Private Michael O'Brien of the Irish Brigade had not spoken a word since the battle ended, despite having been known as one of the most talkative men in his regiment. In the Confederate camp, the psychological devastation was equally severe. Colonel James Kemper, wounded during Pickett's charge, lay in a commandeered farmhouse, his physical wounds healing, but his spirit shattered. He had led his Virginia Brigade across that terrible field, watching his men fall like wheat before. The scythe and the weight of their sacrifice pressed down upon him like a physical force. "I can see their faces," Kemper whispered to his aide, Lieutenant Samuel Foster. "Every boy who followed me into that hell. They trusted me, and I led them to slaughter." The colonel's voice broke, and Foster found himself at a loss for words. How could he comfort a man who carried the deaths of hundreds on his conscience? The medical community was beginning to recognize patterns in the survivors' behavior, though they lacked the scientific framework to properly understand what they were observing. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, working with wounded soldiers in Philadelphia, had begun documenting cases of what he termed irritable heart, a condition characterized by rapid heartbeat, sweating, and extreme anxiety that seemed to have no physical cause. The families of the survivors faced their own unique challenges. Mary Patterson waited anxiously for news of her husband, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Patterson of the 14th Connecticut Infantry. When he finally returned home on leave, she barely recognized the man who walked through her door. The confident, jovial husband she had married had been replaced by a haunted stranger who started at every sound and seemed unable to show affection to his own children. "He sits by the window for hours," Mary confided to her sister, "staring at nothing, his hands shaking like an old man's. Sometimes I hear him crying in the night, but when I try to comfort him, he pushes me away. It's as if the man I married died at Gettysburg, and this broken shell is all that came home." The children of Gettysburg bore their own invisible scars. Young Billy Bailey, only 15 years old, had served as a drummer boy with the 20th Maine and had witnessed horrors that no child should ever see. His parents noticed that he had stopped playing his drum, and when they asked him why, he simply said that he could no longer bear to hear the sound. The rhythm that had once filled him with joy now reminded him of the cadence of marching feet heading toward death. Local businesses struggled to return to normal operations as the town grappled with the aftermath. The photographers who had come to document the battle, including the famous Alexander Gardner, captured images that would become seared into the American consciousness. But for those who had lived through the experience, these photographs served as unwelcome reminders of trauma they were desperately trying to forget. According to contemporary accounts in the New York Times, the battle's psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate participants. Entire communities found themselves changed by the experience, their faith in the nobility of war shattered by the reality of its consequences. The romantic notions of martial glory that had characterized the early years of the conflict were replaced by a grim understanding of war's true cost. As the summer of 1863 wore on, it became increasingly clear that the Battle of Gettysburg had created two distinct groups of casualties: those whose bodies had been broken by bullet and shell, and those whose minds had been shattered by the horror of what they had witnessed. The latter group, invisible to the naked eye, would prove to be the more numerous and, in many ways, the more tragic victims of those 3 terrible days in Pennsylvania. The train whistle's mournful cry echoed across the Pennsylvania countryside as the first groups of recovering soldiers began their journey home in late July, 1863. For many, this should have been a moment of celebration. They had survived the deadliest battle of the Civil War and were returning to their families. Instead, the railway cars were filled with hollow-eyed men who stared silently out the windows, their minds still trapped on the bloody fields of Gettysburg. Lieutenant Thomas Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Infantry sat rigidly in his seat, his hands clenched tightly in his lap to stop their trembling. He had been wounded in the final moments of the battle, a Confederate bullet grazing his shoulder, but it was not the physical pain that tormented him. Every click of the train wheels on the track sounded like musket fire to his ears. Every whistle of the locomotive reminded him of the screams of the dying. Across the aisle, Sergeant Patrick Murphy of the 69th Pennsylvania Infantry struggled with his own demons. A veteran of Bull Run and Antietam, Murphy had thought himself, hardened to the realities of war. But something about Gettysburg had broken through his carefully constructed emotional armor. The Irish immigrant who had once regaled his comrades with jokes and songs now found himself unable to speak above a whisper. "I keep thinking about the smell," Murphy confided to his seatmate, a young private who had lost his left leg to a Confederate cannonball. Not just the gunpowder and blood, but the smell of fear. You could smell it on every man, Union and Confederate alike. It was the smell of boys realizing they were about to die. The homecoming experiences varied widely, but few were the joyful reunions that families had imagined. In small towns across New England, wives and mothers found themselves caring for men who seemed like strangers. The confident soldiers who had marched away to war had been replaced by nervous, jumpy individuals who could not bear to be touched and who woke screaming in the night. Sarah Mitchell of Portland, Maine, had prepared for weeks for her son's return. She had cooked all his favorite foods, decorated the house with bunting, and invited neighbors to welcome him home. But when Private David Mitchell walked through the door, the celebration died in her throat. Her boy, who had left home with bright eyes and a ready smile, now moved like an old man, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. "He won't eat at the table with us," Sarah wrote to her sister. "He takes his plate to the corner where he can see all the doors and windows. He jumps when the cat knocks something over, and yesterday he dove behind the furniture when our neighbor's hunting rifle went off. What did they do to my boy?" The medical establishment was slowly beginning to recognize that many veterans were suffering from ailments that could not be treated with traditional medicine. Dr. Jacob Mendez da Costa, working at Turner's Lane Hospital in Philadelphia, had identified a condition he called soldier's heart, a syndrome characterized by rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, and chest pain that seemed to have no physical cause. His observations, documented in medical journals of the period, represented some of the earliest systematic studies of what would later be understood as combat stress reaction. Religious communities struggled to provide comfort to men whose faith had been shaken by what they had witnessed. Reverend Elijah Kellogg of Harpswell, Maine, found himself counseling veterans who questioned the existence of a benevolent God. "How can there be divine justice?" one veteran asked him, "when good
men die screaming in the mud while cowards live to see another day."
The problem extended beyond individual suffering to entire communities. Towns that had sent companies of local boys to war found themselves trying to reintegrate traumatized veterans into civilian life. The social fabric that had once held these communities together was strained by the presence of men who could no longer participate in normal activities. Church services, town meetings, and social gatherings became difficult for veterans who could not tolerate crowds or loud noises. As reported in the Atlantic Monthly, the phenomenon was not limited to enlisted men. Officers who had commanded troops in battle often suffered the most severe psychological wounds, tormented by the knowledge that their decisions had led to the deaths of men under their command. Many resigned their commissions, unable to bear the responsibility of leadership in future engagements. The families of Confederate veterans faced their own unique challenges. In addition to dealing with traumatized loved ones, they had to cope with the stigma of defeat and the economic devastation that followed. Many Southern communities lacked the resources to provide adequate care for their returning veterans, leaving families to struggle alone with problems they did not understand. As the summer of 1863 drew to a close, it became clear that the Battle of Gettysburg had created a new category of casualty: the walking wounded, men whose bodies had survived but whose spirits had been broken. These invisible wounds would prove to be among the most enduring legacies of those 3 terrible days in Pennsylvania, affecting not just the veterans themselves, but their families and communities for generations to come. The autumn leaves were turning gold and crimson in the hills surrounding Gettysburg when Dr. Jonathan Letterman made his final visit to the battlefield in October 1863. 3 months had passed since the guns fell silent, but the doctor had returned to check on the long-term effects of what he was beginning to understand as a new kind of warfare casualty. The physical wounds had largely healed, but the invisible injuries to the human spirit proved far more persistent and complex. In the weeks following the battle, Letterman had established what would become known as the first systematic approach to treating what he termed nostalgia, a condition characterized by persistent melancholy, inability to concentrate, and an overwhelming desire to return to one's pre-war life. Working with a small team of volunteer physicians, he had begun documenting the symptoms and attempting various treatments for veterans who seemed unable to readjust to civilian life. Captain William Thompson, formerly of the 5th Corps, had become one of Letterman's most compelling case studies. A successful merchant before the war, Thompson had returned to his family's dry goods business in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but found himself unable to function in the commercial world. The simple act of inventory management, which had once been second nature to him, now seemed impossibly complex. His wife, Margaret, had written to Letterman describing how her husband would spend hours staring at columns of numbers, his hands shaking as he tried to make sense of figures that had once been as familiar as his own name. "The strangest thing," Margaret wrote, "is that he seems to have lost all sense of time. He'll start a task in the morning and still be working on it when I call him for supper, completely unaware that the day has passed. Sometimes I find him in the store after midnight, reorganizing the same shelf over and over again." Similar patterns were emerging throughout the North and South. In Richmond, Virginia, Confederate surgeon Dr. Hunter Holmes McGuire had begun treating veterans with symptoms that mirrored those observed by Letterman. Former Confederate soldiers were presenting with complaints of persistent headaches, inability to sleep, and sudden outbursts of violence that seemed to come from nowhere. McGuire noted that many of these men had been perfectly normal before the war, leading him to conclude that the trauma of battle had somehow permanently altered their mental faculties. The religious community played a crucial role in the healing process, though not always in ways that proved helpful. Some ministers preached that the veterans' suffering was divine punishment for the sin of taking human life, while others suggested that their trauma was a test of faith. A few progressive clergy members, however, began to develop what would later be recognized as early forms of pastoral counseling, focusing on the idea that healing required both spiritual and emotional support. Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, writing in his influential journal The Independent, argued that society had a moral obligation to care for veterans whose minds had been wounded in service to their country. His essays, which were widely read throughout the North, helped to shift public perception of traumatized veterans from objects of pity or suspicion to individuals deserving of compassion and medical care. The families of veterans often found themselves serving as the primary caregivers for men who required constant attention and support. Elizabeth Custer, wife of the flamboyant cavalry officer, wrote extensively about the challenges faced by military families dealing with the psychological aftermath of combat. Her letters, preserved in the National Archives, provide a unique glimpse into the domestic struggles that accompanied the more visible wounds of war. "George returns from each engagement changed," she wrote to her sister. "Not wounded in body, but wounded in spirit. He speaks of his dead comrades as if they were still alive, and sometimes I find him setting places at the table for men who fell months ago. The doctors say this is temporary, but I fear it may be permanent." Innovation in treatment methods began to emerge from unexpected sources. Some veterans found relief in occupational therapy, though the term would not be coined. For decades, former soldiers who worked with their hands, carpenters, blacksmiths, farmers, often recovered more quickly than those in sedentary occupations. The rhythmic, repetitive nature of manual labor seemed to provide a form of meditation that helped quiet the chaos in their minds. According to contemporary accounts in Harper's New Monthly magazine, some veterans formed informal support groups, gathering in taverns and meeting halls to share their experiences with others who understood what they had endured. These gatherings, while sometimes accompanied by excessive drinking, provided a form of group therapy that proved more effective than individual treatment in many cases. The artistic community also played a role in the healing process. Painters, writers, and musicians began creating works that attempted to capture the emotional reality of combat, providing veterans with a means of expression for experiences that seemed beyond the power of ordinary language to convey. The haunting melodies of songs like "Tenting on the Old Campground" and "When This Cruel War Is Over" spoke to the deep longing for peace that characterized the veteran experience. As 1863 drew to a close, the medical community was beginning to recognize that the Battle of Gettysburg had created not just a new understanding of military medicine, but a new appreciation for the complexity of the human response to trauma. The healing process, they were learning, would be measured not in weeks or months but in years and decades. The dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery on November 19, 1863, brought together thousands of people who had been touched by the Battle of Gettysburg, President Abraham Lincoln's brief but profound address would be remembered as one of the greatest speeches in American history. But for many of the veterans in attendance, the ceremony served as a painful reminder of all they had lost and all they had yet to overcome. Captain Robert Carter, who had struggled with his own demons since the battle, stood among the crowd of survivors as Lincoln spoke of the unfinished work that remained before them. The president's words about the living, being unable to consecrate the battlefield, struck Carter with particular force. He understood now that the true consecration would come not from speeches or monuments, but from the daily struggle of survivors to rebuild their lives and find meaning in their suffering. As the years passed, the veterans of Gettysburg would carry their invisible wounds into the post-war world, forever changed by their experience on those Pennsylvania fields. Many would never fully recover from what they had endured, but they would find ways to live with their trauma, to build families and careers despite the persistent echoes of battle that followed them. The medical understanding of combat trauma would evolve slowly, with each generation of physicians building upon the observations of their predecessors. Dr. Letterman's documentation of nostalgia and Dr. DaCosta's studies of soldier's heart would eventually contribute to a broader understanding of what the 20th century would call shell shock, combat fatigue, and eventually post-traumatic stress disorder. The families of veterans would also bear lasting scars. Children would grow up in households where the shadow of Gettysburg loomed large, where fathers who had once been strong and confident now struggled with nightmares and sudden fits of rage. Some would follow their fathers into military service, while others would reject anything associated with warfare, creating a complex legacy that would ripple through generations. The town of Gettysburg itself would be forever transformed by the events of July 1863. What had once been a quiet agricultural community became a place of pilgrimage, drawing visitors from around the world who came to understand the price of freedom. The residents who had lived through the battle would spend the rest of their lives retelling their stories, some finding healing in the act of remembrance, others haunted by the constant reminders of those terrible days. The Battle of Gettysburg had demonstrated that warfare's true cost could not be measured solely in terms of military casualties. The psychological wounds inflicted upon survivors would prove to be among the most enduring legacies of the conflict, affecting not just individual lives, but entire communities and generations yet unborn. As the nation moved forward into the challenges of Reconstruction and beyond, the veterans of Gettysburg would carry with them the knowledge that they had witnessed something that had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare itself. They had seen the face of modern combat, and they understood that the price of victory was higher than anyone had imagined when the war began. The emotional aftermath of Gettysburg would serve as a harbinger of what future generations would face in the mechanized conflicts of the 20th century. The lessons learned from treating its traumatized veterans would provide the foundation for understanding combat stress and its treatment, though it would take decades for the medical community to fully grasp the implications of what they had observed. In the end, the Battle of Gettysburg would be remembered not just for its strategic importance or its role in turning the tide of the Civil War, but for its revelation of the human cost of modern warfare. The men who fought there, both Union and Confederate, would carry the burden of their experience for the rest of their lives, their sacrifice extending far beyond the 3 days of battle to encompass years of struggle with invisible wounds that would never fully heal. Their legacy would be one of endurance, of the human spirit's capacity to survive trauma and find meaning in suffering. Though they could never forget what they had experienced, they would learn to live with their memories, to build new lives upon the foundation of their pain, and to serve as witnesses to the true cost of war for generations yet to come.